I'm Dr. Valentina Reyes, and I spent 16 years as a disaster relief medic with international emergency response, or at least I was, until I submitted my transfer request to domestic clinic work 8 months ago. You can call me Dr. Reyes if you want, though most people in the field just called me Val during my decade and a half, responding to some of the world's worst disasters. What I'm about to tell you is the one incident that still gives me nightmares, makes me wake up in cold sweats, and ultimately forced me to realize I could never set foot in another disaster zone again. International Emergency Response is one of the largest humanitarian medical organizations in the world, operating in over 80 countries and responding to natural disasters, conflict zones, and humanitarian crises. During my 16 years with them, I had deployed to more disaster zones than I care to count. The 2010 earthquake in Chile, where I performed emergency amputations by candlelight. The 2018 tsunami in Sulawesi, where I worked for 72 hours straight, treating drowning victims and crush injuries. The refugee camps along the Syrian border, where malnutrition and disease ran rampant. Hurricane aftermath in Puerto Rico, volcanic eruptions in Guatemala, floods in Bangladesh, wildfires in Australia. I specialized in trauma surgery and emergency medicine, which meant I was often among the first medical responders deployed to the most challenging situations. I had performed life-saving operations in bombed-out hospitals, flooded clinics, collapsed buildings, and makeshift field units set up in school gymnasiums and parking lots. I thought I had seen every kind of human suffering and medical emergency possible. I prided myself on staying calm under pressure, making quick life or death decisions, and adapting to impossible working conditions. Over the years, I had treated thousands of patients in the aftermath of disasters. I had held dying children in my arms, performed surgery with inadequate supplies, and made the horrible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help when resources were limited. I thought I was mentally prepared for anything emergency medicine could throw at me. I had developed what my colleagues called an iron stomach and nerves of steel, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened during Hurricane Esperanza in September 2023. Hurricane Esperanza was a Category 5 monster that formed rapidly in the Atlantic and maintained its devastating strength as it made landfall along the coast of South Carolina. The storm was unprecedented in its intensity and the speed with which it developed, catching meteorologists and emergency management officials off guard. Within 48 hours, it went from a tropical depression to one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. The hurricane made landfall near the town of Crescent Bay, a coastal community of about 12,000 people located on Palmetto Island, connected to the mainland by a single causeway bridge. The storm surge reached heights of nearly 20 feet, completely overwhelming the town's flood defenses and turning streets into raging rivers. Winds exceeding 185 miles per hour tore through the community like a giant blender, reducing century-old oak trees to splinters and turning houses into projectiles. I received the deployment call at 6 a.m. on September 23rd, just hours after the hurricane had passed. I was at my apartment in Atlanta, having just returned from a deployment in Morocco following an earthquake there. The call came from our emergency dispatch coordinator, Marcus Chen, who briefed me on the situation as I threw my gear into my ready bag. "Val, we need you in South Carolina immediately," Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. "Crescent Bay has been completely cut off. The causeway bridge is gone, cell towers are down, and we have no communication with anyone on the island. Coast Guard flyovers show catastrophic damage. We're talking about a community that's been essentially wiped off the map." Our rapid response team consisted of 6 medical professionals and 2 logistics specialists. Besides myself, we had Dr. James Whitfield, an emergency physician from Boston, Dr. Keiko Tanaka, an orthopedic surgeon, Rebecca Martinez, a trauma nurse with 20 years of experience, David Kim, a paramedic, and Sarah Thompson, a mental health counselor specializing in disaster trauma. Our logistics team included equipment specialist Robert Hayes and communications expert Lisa Wang. We flew out of Atlanta on a military transport helicopter, since civilian aircraft couldn't safely navigate the continuing severe weather conditions. The flight took us over areas of South Carolina that looked like they had been carpet bombed. Entire forests were flattened in perfect geometric patterns, showing the hurricane's path. Towns that should have been visible from the air appeared to have vanished entirely, replaced by fields of debris and standing water. As we approached Palmetto Island, the scope of the destruction became truly apparent. What had once been Crescent Bay was now barely recognizable as a human settlement. The harbor that had been home to dozens of fishing boats was filled with debris, pieces of houses, overturned cars, boats that had been carried miles inland. The main commercial district was completely gone, reduced to concrete slabs and twisted metal. Most devastating of all, the causeway bridge that connected the island to the mainland had collapsed into the churning waters below, leaving the surviving residents completely isolated. Our pilot, Captain Rodriguez, surveyed the area for a safe landing zone. "I can't set down anywhere near the town center," he shouted over the rotor noise. "Too much debris and power lines. I'm going to have to drop you on the high ground near what used to be the elementary school." We rappelled down into what looked like a war zone. The silence was eerie and overwhelming after the constant noise of the helicopter. No traffic, no machinery, no normal sounds of human activity. Just the occasional creak of damaged buildings, settling, and distant calls for help carried on the wind. The elementary school that served as our landing zone had lost most of its roof, but the gymnasium remained partially intact. We quickly established this as our base of operations, setting up our mobile medical unit with portable surgical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and communication gear. The scene was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Scattered among the debris were children's artwork and school supplies, reminders of the normal life that had existed here just days before. Within an hour of landing, we had a basic triage area set up and were ready to receive patients. Rebecca Martinez, our trauma nurse, had organized our limited supply of medications and equipment with military precision. Dr. Tanaka was assembling a makeshift surgical table using school cafeteria tables and waterproof sheeting. David Kim, our paramedic, was testing our radio equipment and trying to establish communication with the outside world. The first survivors started arriving shortly after we set up our operations. They came in small groups, helping each other navigate the debris-filled streets. Many were in shock, moving with the slow, deliberate movements of people who had experienced trauma beyond their ability to process. Others were focused with the intense energy that comes from pure survival instinct. Our first patient was an elderly man named Harold Peterson, who had suffered a compound fracture of his left leg when his house collapsed around him. He had been trapped for nearly 2 days before neighbors could dig him out. His wound was infected, and he was severely dehydrated, but he was conscious and able to provide information about other survivors who needed help. "There are at least 30 people trapped in the basement of the old Riverside apartments," he told us as Dr. Tanaka worked to stabilize his fracture. "Building's still standing, but the entrance is completely blocked, and there's a family with a baby on Marsh Street. Their house is flooded, but they're alive on the second floor." Standard disaster response for the first 2 days. Our work followed the typical patterns of disaster relief medicine. We treated a steady stream of survivors with injuries you would expect after a hurricane of this magnitude. Lacerations from flying debris, broken bones from falling structures, severe cuts from broken glass, infections from contaminated flood water, dehydration, and hypothermia from prolonged exposure. Dr. Whitfield handled most of the internal medicine cases, heart problems exacerbated by stress, diabetics who had lost access to their medications, elderly patients with respiratory problems from inhaling debris and mold spores. Dr. Tanaka dealt with the orthopedic injuries, a seemingly endless parade of broken arms, legs, ribs, and more complex fractures that required immediate surgical intervention. I focused primarily on trauma surgery and the most critical cases. In those first 48 hours, I performed emergency surgery on a construction worker whose abdomen had been pierced by a piece of rebar, operated on a woman whose skull had been fractured by falling debris, and treated numerous victims of severe lacerations that required extensive suturing and wound cleaning. Sarah Thompson, our mental health counselor, worked with families who were searching for missing relatives and survivors who were showing signs of severe psychological trauma. Rebecca Martinez managed our patient flow, ensuring that the most critical cases received immediate attention, while less urgent patients were made comfortable and monitored. The work was exhausting, but routine in the context of disaster medicine. We worked in rotating shifts, grabbing sleep in 2-hour increments, eating cold MREs when we remembered to eat at all. It was challenging, emotionally draining work, but it was work I had done dozens of times before in similar circumstances. But on our third day, September 26th, everything changed. At approximately 2:15 p.m. on September 26th, a Coast Guard rescue team brought in an unconscious woman they had found in the basement of a house that had been completely destroyed. The house itself was nothing but a foundation and scattered debris, but somehow the basement had remained intact, forming a small air pocket that had kept her alive. The woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, with dark hair and olive skin. She was suffering from severe hypothermia, multiple lacerations on her arms and legs, and clear signs of prolonged exposure and dehydration. Her clothing was torn and soaked, indicating she had been trapped in standing water for an extended period. She had no identification with her, no purse or wallet, and no family members or friends had come forward looking for anyone matching her description. The rescue team leader, Petty Officer Martinez, gave us what little information they had. We found her about 3 miles inland in what used to be the Riverside neighborhood, he explained. House was completely gone, nothing left but the foundation, but the basement had somehow stayed intact, and she was down there in about 2 feet of water. Been unconscious the whole time we've been trying to get her out. Probably been trapped for at least 3 days, based on the condition of the debris around the house. Since we had no way to identify her, I decided to call her Elena, a name that seemed to fit her appearance, and that would make it easier for our team to refer to her while providing care. Elena's vital signs were weak, but stable. Her core body temperature was dangerously low, at 89 degrees Fahrenheit, but she was breathing on her own and had a detectable pulse. Her blood pressure was low, but not critical, and preliminary examination showed no obvious signs of head trauma or spinal injuries that would explain her unconscious state. I started Elena on standard hypothermia treatment protocols, gradual rewarming using heated blankets and warm intravenous fluids, wound cleaning and antibiotic treatment for her lacerations, and continuous monitoring of her vital signs. Based on my experience, I expected her to regain consciousness within a few hours once her body temperature returned to normal and the effects of prolonged exposure began to subside. As I was cleaning and examining Elena's wounds under our portable surgical lights, I noticed something that made me pause. On her left forearm, just below the elbow, were what appeared to be numbers that had been carved into her skin. They were fresh. The wounds were still in the early stages of healing, but they had been made with deliberate precision, despite her other injuries being chaotic trauma wounds from the hurricane. The numbers read, September 27th, 23, September 27th, 23, tomorrow's date. I stared at the marking for several long moments, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The carving was too precise and deliberate to have been accidental. It appeared to have been made with a sharp instrument, possibly a knife or piece of glass, and the depth and consistency of the cuts suggested they had been made carefully and intentionally. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe Elena had carved tomorrow's date into her arm as a way of keeping track of time while she was trapped, some kind of psychological coping mechanism. People do strange things under extreme stress, and maintaining a sense of time and date can be important for psychological survival in traumatic situations. But the more I examined the carving, the less sense this explanation made. If Elena had been unconscious since we found her, when would she have had the opportunity to make this marking? And why tomorrow's date, rather than today's or yesterday's? The wounds were fresh but not immediate. They had been made at least 12 hours earlier, possibly more. I decided not to mention the date carving to the rest of my team immediately. In disaster medicine, you encounter a lot of unusual injuries and behaviors, and I didn't want to distract from our primary mission of treating patients and saving lives. I made a note in Elena's medical file and continued with her treatment. About 4 hours after Elena arrived, as I was checking her vital signs during my evening rounds, she began to speak. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing was steady and regular, and all her vital signs indicated she was still unconscious. But she began speaking clearly, calmly, as if she were having a normal conversation with someone in the room. "The water is rising in Building C," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite her unconscious state. "Third floor, room 307. The man in the blue flannel shirt needs epinephrine in 6 minutes, or he'll go into cardiac arrest." I looked around our makeshift clinic in confusion. We weren't in any building with numbered rooms or floors. We were in the remnants of an elementary school gymnasium. There was no Building C anywhere in our immediate area, and I could see everyone in our treatment space. There was no man in a blue flannel shirt anywhere near us. Rebecca Martinez, who was working nearby, looked over at me with raised eyebrows. "Did she just give us a medical recommendation?" she asked quietly. I checked Elena's pupils and vital signs again, still unconscious by every medical indicator I could measure. "I think she's having some kind of dream or hallucination related to her trauma," I said. "Head injury patients sometimes have vivid dreams that they verbalize."
Yeah.
But even as I said it, something about Elena's statement bothered me. She had spoken with medical terminology and precision that seemed beyond what someone without medical training would typically use. And there was something about the specificity of her statement, 6 minutes until cardiac arrest, that felt more like a medical assessment than a traumatic hallucination. The predictions begin over the next several hours. Elena continued making these strange specific statements while remaining completely unconscious. She would speak clearly and calmly, make detailed observations about medical situations that didn't exist in our immediate environment, and provide treatment recommendations using proper medical terminology. At 8:42 p.m., she said, "The little girl with the fractured radius will arrive in 12 minutes. She's allergic to amoxicillin and sulfur drugs. Her name is Sophie Chen, and she'll be carrying a yellow stuffed duck." I noted the time and Elena's statement in her medical file, partly out of curiosity, and partly because something about the precision of her predictions was starting to unnerve me. At 8:54 p.m., exactly 12 minutes later, Coast Guard rescuers brought in a 7-year-old girl with a broken arm. She was clutching a yellow stuffed duck and crying for her grandmother. When I knelt down to examine her arm, I asked gently, "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie Chen," she whispered through her tears. When her grandmother arrived a few minutes later, I asked about allergies before administering any pain medication. "Oh yes," the elderly woman said immediately. "Sophie is severely allergic to penicillin and sulfur drugs. We always have to be very careful with antibiotics." I felt a chill run down my spine. Elena had predicted the arrival of this specific patient, her exact injury, her name, her allergies, and even the toy she would be carrying, all while remaining completely unconscious. At 10:17 p.m., Elena made another prediction. The fisherman with the punctured lung will need a chest tube in 23 minutes. His name is Robert, and he'll tell you the accident happened when he was trying to save his boat. The puncture is on the left side, between the fourth and fifth ribs. At 10:40 p.m., rescue workers brought in a middle-aged man with obvious breathing difficulties. He introduced himself as Robert Vasquez and explained that he had been injured when trying to secure his fishing boat as the hurricane approached. "Piece of the mast broke off and got me right in the ribs," he said, gasping for breath. Dr. Whitfield's examination revealed a punctured lung on the left side, with the entry wound located precisely between the fourth and fifth ribs. He required immediate chest tube insertion to re-expand his collapsed lung. By midnight, Elena had accurately predicted the arrival and specific medical conditions of 5 different patients. She had described their injuries with medical precision, provided their names before they arrived, and given detailed treatment recommendations that proved to be medically sound and appropriate. Growing team awareness word of Elena's unusual behavior began spreading among our medical team. Rebecca Martinez started keeping a written log of Elena's predictions and their outcomes. Dr. Tanaka began timing the predictions to see if there was any pattern to their accuracy. Even David Kim, our paramedic who was typically focused on practical emergency response, started paying attention to what Elena was saying. "This is impossible," Dr. Whitfield said during a brief break in patient treatment. "There's no medical explanation for how an unconscious patient could predict specific injuries and patient arrivals, and she's using medical terminology that suggests formal training, but we have no information about her background." Dr. Tanaka was more cautious in her assessment. "We've all seen unusual behavior in head injury patients," she said. "Sometimes trauma can cause vivid hallucinations or false memories. Maybe she's incorporating sounds and voices from our treatment area into her unconscious mind and creating elaborate scenarios." But as the night continued, Elena's predictions became even more specific and accurate. She described the contents of supply boxes before we opened them, warned us about equipment failures minutes before they occurred, and provided detailed directions for locating trapped survivors in areas of the town we hadn't even been able to search yet. At 2:15 a.m., she said, "Your portable X-ray machine will malfunction in 8 minutes. The power coupling on the left side is loose. Dr. Tanaka will need to use the backup unit for the woman with the possible spinal fracture." At 2:23 a.m., exactly 8 minutes later, our X-ray machine suddenly shut down during Dr. Tanaka's examination of a patient with back injuries. David Kim checked the equipment and found that the power coupling on the left side had indeed come loose. We had to switch to our backup unit to complete the examination. At 3:47 a.m., Elena provided specific directions to a collapsed building, where she said we would find an elderly man and a teenage boy trapped but alive in what used to be a hardware store. The building was 6 blocks from our location, in an area we hadn't been able to search due to dangerous debris. When a rescue team followed Elena's directions, they found exactly what she had described: Harold Wilson, age 73, and his grandson Tommy, age 16, trapped but alive in the ruins of Wilson's hardware store. By the morning of September 27th, the date carved into Elena's arm, it was clear to everyone on our medical team that something unprecedented was happening. Elena remained completely unconscious by every standard medical measure we could apply, yet she was demonstrating knowledge and awareness that seemed medically impossible. She had accurately predicted the arrival, injuries and personal details of 14 different patients. She had provided advance warning of equipment failures, supply shortages, and logistical problems that occurred exactly when she said they would. Most remarkably, she had guided rescue teams to the locations of trapped survivors with precision that defied explanation. Every prediction was unnaturally accurate. Every piece of medical advice was not just sound but optimal, given our limited resources and challenging circumstances. And Elena showed no signs of consciousness through any of it. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing steady, her responses to physical stimuli consistent with unconsciousness. Dr. Whitfield began questioning everything he thought he knew about consciousness and awareness. In 30 years of emergency medicine, I have never seen anything like this, he confided to me during a brief break. She's providing medical assessments that are more accurate than some of our diagnostic equipment, predicting events that haven't happened yet, and demonstrating knowledge about patients and situations she couldn't possibly have encountered. Sarah Thompson, our mental health counselor, was particularly intrigued by the psychological implications. If Elena is somehow consciously aware of her surroundings while appearing unconscious, what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? And if she's predicting future events, how do we explain that from any known psychological or neurological framework? But then as September 27th progressed, the exact date carved into Elena's arm, her predictions began to take on a darker, more ominous tone. The cheerful, helpful medical recommendations gave way to warnings about danger and death. At 11:47 p.m. on September 27th, Elena suddenly sat bolt upright in her stretcher. Her eyes remained closed, but her posture was rigid and alert. When she spoke, her voice carried across our entire makeshift clinic with an intensity that made everyone stop what they were doing and listen. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to everyone in the room. "Someone in this room will make a choice that kills 3 people. I can see their faces clearly. I can see exactly how they die. And Dr. Reyes, one of those 3 people is you." The silence that followed was complete and horrifying. 6 medical professionals and 2 logistics specialists, all of us experienced in emergency medicine and disaster response, stood frozen as we processed what Elena had just said. Then just as suddenly as she had sat up, Elena lay back down on her stretcher. Her breathing returned to normal, her posture relaxed, and she appeared to return to her previous state of unconsciousness. But the damage was done. Elena's final prediction had introduced an element of terror into our disaster relief mission that none of us were prepared to handle. What happened next, and how Elena's impossible knowledge ultimately forced me to make the most devastating decision of my medical career, is a story that still haunts my dreams and changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the responsibility we carry when we try to save lives in impossible circumstances. September 28th arrived with an oppressive heat that made our makeshift clinic feel like an oven. Elena's death prediction hung over our team like a dark cloud, but we had work to do. At exactly noon, when the sun reached its highest point, just as Elena had predicted, everything went wrong simultaneously. A building collapse 6 blocks away had trapped an entire family. The Coast Guard radioed that a medical evacuation helicopter was finally available, but only for 1 critical patient, and Elena, still unconscious, began speaking again. "Dr. Reyes, you have 30 seconds to choose. The helicopter can save the dying child with internal bleeding, or it can take me to the mainland hospital, where I'll wake up and warn the authorities about the gas leak that will kill everyone in Building C tonight. You cannot save both. Choose wrong, and 3 people die." My blood ran cold. There was no Building C in our area, no gas leak we knew about, but Elena had been right about everything else. The child, 8-year-old Marcus Torres, had severe internal injuries from the building collapse. Without immediate surgical intervention at a real hospital, he would die within hours. That Elena was indicating that taking her instead would somehow prevent multiple deaths. I had 30 seconds to decide who lived and who died. The impossible choice. I looked at Marcus, his small body broken and bleeding, his parents pleading with their eyes for me to save their son. Every instinct in my medical training screamed to put him on that helicopter. He was a child, he was dying, he could be saved. But Elena had predicted 14 specific medical emergencies with perfect accuracy. If she was right about the gas leak, the helicopter takes Elena, I announced, my voice barely audible over the rotor noise. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Whitfield stared at me in disbelief. Marcus's parents collapsed in grief. Rebecca Martinez grabbed my arm. "Val, what are you doing? That boy will die without surgery. Put Elena on the helicopter," I repeated, hating myself with every word. As they loaded Elena's unconscious form onto the aircraft, she opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. She looked directly at me and whispered words that still echo in my nightmares. "You chose correctly. The boy would have died anyway. His injuries were too severe." But now 17 people in Building C will live, including Dr. Whitfield and Rebecca Martinez. The helicopter lifted off. Marcus Torres died 43 minutes later in my arms. The revelation that evening, Elena's final prediction proved accurate in the most horrifying way possible. A propane gas leak in a collapsed apartment complex, a building the rescue teams had designated as Building C, would have killed 17 trapped survivors if Elena hadn't reached the mainland to warn the authorities. But Elena never made it to the hospital. The helicopter crashed in a sudden storm, killing her, the pilot, and the paramedic aboard. 3 deaths, exactly as she had predicted. The gas leak was discovered and contained just hours before it would have become lethal. 17 people, including 2 of my team members who were conducting rescue operations in that building, lived because of Elena's warning. I had made the right choice by every logical measure. I had saved 17 lives at the cost of 4, but Marcus Torres's face, his parents' grief, and the weight of playing God based on the impossible predictions of an unconscious stranger broke something fundamental inside me. The aftermath. The official investigation into Elena's identity revealed nothing. No missing person reports matched her description. No family claimed her body. She appeared in our disaster zone like a ghost, delivered impossible knowledge that saved lives, and vanished just as mysteriously. Medical experts I consulted had no explanation for Elena's prophetic abilities. The carved date, the accurate predictions, the knowledge she couldn't have possessed, none of it made scientific sense. Some suggested mass hallucination or shared psychological trauma affecting our team's perception of events, but the documented evidence was undeniable. The families of the helicopter crash victims filed lawsuits questioning my decision to prioritize an unconscious Jane Doe over a dying child. Media coverage portrayed me as either a hero who saved 17 lives or a monster who condemned 4 people to death based on supernatural delusions. Both narratives felt true and false simultaneously. I submitted my resignation from International Emergency Response 3 months later. I couldn't trust my judgment anymore. How do you practice medicine when you've seen the impossible? How do you make life and death decisions when you know there are forces beyond medical understanding that might be guiding events? The haunting questions. Elena's case fundamentally changed everything I believed about medicine, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Was she somehow psychic, able to see future events while unconscious? Was she connected to some larger force or intelligence that guided disaster response? Or was there a medical explanation that our current understanding of neuroscience simply cannot comprehend? The questions that keep me awake at night aren't medical, they're philosophical and moral. If Elena could see the future, did we all have free will, or were we just playing out predetermined events? When I chose to put her on that helicopter, was I exercising medical judgment or fulfilling a destiny she had already foreseen? Most disturbing of all, Elena saved 17 lives by warning about the gas leak, but she died in the process, along with the helicopter crew. If she knew she would die, and she had predicted 3 deaths, including her own, why did she accept that fate? Was her sacrifice intentional, a conscious choice to trade her life for the lives of others? The the new reality. I now work in a quiet family practice in rural Montana, treating routine ailments and avoiding anything that challenges my understanding of medical science. But Elena's case taught me that medicine, for all its advances and protocols, still encounters profound mysteries that humiliate our assumptions about consciousness, prediction, and human capability. Every disaster relief medic has stories they can't explain, moments when intuition trumped training, when patients recovered against all odds, when split-second decisions saved lives in ways that seemed guided by more than medical knowledge. But most of us dismiss these experiences as coincidence or adrenaline-fueled perception. Elena's case forces a different conclusion, that consciousness might operate in ways our current understanding cannot measure, that some people might access knowledge through mechanisms science has yet to discover, and that the line between possible and impossible is far more fluid than medical training suggests. The families I failed to save will always haunt me, but the 17 people who lived because of Elena's impossible knowledge remind me that sometimes the most terrifying moments in medicine reveal truths about human consciousness that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the mysterious forces that guide our most crucial decisions. Elena's legacy isn't just the lives she saved, it's the humbling reminder that medicine still contains profound mysteries that demand respect, caution, and the wisdom to acknowledge when we're encountering something beyond our current understanding.